The accident happened on a Saturday morning in early autumn, and I remember every detail of the seconds before it. The smell of rain on warm asphalt. The way the sun was cutting through the clouds at just the right angle to make everything look golden and unreal. I was crossing the street near the university's east gate, coffee in one hand, my phone tucked into my jacket pocket. I wasn't looking at the screen. I wasn't distracted. I was actually, for once in my life, just existing in the moment. And then, the sound, tires screaming, metal folding, and a wall of pressure that hit me from the left and sent me flying. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. When I opened my eyes, I expected the harsh fluorescent light that everyone complains about in hospitals. Instead, I got nothing. Just dark. Just the sensation of eyelids lifting and nothing changing, and the slow, horrifying understanding that something was profoundly wrong. My name is Stan York. I was 23 years old when I lost my sight, and I was in love, or I believed I was, with 3 brothers who were about to show me exactly how wrong I had been about them, about love, and about myself. The 3 brothers were the Ashford triplets, Rowan, River, and Reed Ashford. They were legends on our campus, and I use the word legends because that's genuinely how people spoke about them. In hushed, reverent tones, like they were myths who had somehow taken human form and enrolled in postgraduate studies. They were identical in the way that only triplets can be. Not copies of each other, but variations on a theme so beautiful it made your chest ache. Dark hair, sharp jaw, gray eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over still water. They moved through the world like they owned it, because, in many ways, they did. Their family had money the way mountains have altitude. It was simply a fundamental feature of what they were. I had met them 9 months before the accident, at a gallery opening that I attended mostly because my roommate dragged me there and promised free wine. Rowan had come up to me first. He said he liked my jacket. I said thank you. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that rearranges things inside your chest, moves furniture around in rooms you didn't know you had. River found us 20 minutes later, and Reed appeared somewhere after midnight when the gallery was thinning out, and somehow by the end of the night I had given all 3 of them my number. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded even then. But there was something intoxicating about their attention, the way all 3 of them orbited me, the way they made me feel like the center of something vast and important. In the weeks that followed, there were dinners and walks and late-night messages and mornings where one of them would show up at the coffee shop near my apartment with an extra cup. I was dazzled. I was completely, embarrassingly dazzled. What I didn't understand then, lying in that hospital bed with darkness pressing in from all sides, was that I had never been the center of anything with the Ashfords. I had been a game, a pleasant diversion. A competition between 3 bored, beautiful men who were accustomed to getting everything they wanted and had decided, for reasons I never fully understood, that I was interesting enough to pursue for a while. The understanding came slowly, in the days and weeks after the accident, because at first they were there. Rowan was the first to visit. He sat beside my bed and held my hand and said all the right things. His voice was low and careful, the way people speak when they're not sure how much weight their words can bear. He said he was so sorry. He said he'd been terrified when he heard. He said I was going to be all right. I couldn't see his face, but I held on to the sound of his voice like a rope in dark water. River brought flowers, which made my nurse laugh gently because she had to describe them to me. Yellow, she said, sunflowers, and I thought that was very River of him. Dramatic and warm at the same time. He read to me from the book he found on my nightstand, doing different voices for all the characters, and for an hour I forgot that I was lying in a hospital bed, unable to see anything at all. Reed was quieter. He sat with me without needing to fill the silence, and once when I started crying because the doctor had come in and the news was not good, not permanent, they said, but potentially long-term, potentially months, potentially longer. Reed put his arm around me and let me cry into his shoulder without saying a single useless thing. That silence felt at the time like the most loving thing any of them had done. The doctors told me the condition had a name, a clinical name that I can rattle off now without flinching, but in those early days it felt like a curse word, a label that was stamping itself onto my identity without my permission. Traumatic optic neuropathy, complicated by swelling around the occipital lobe, possibly temporary. Possibly not. Rehabilitation would be required regardless. Learning to navigate a new reality would begin immediately. My mother flew in from across the country and turned my recovery into her project, in the loving, suffocating way that only mothers can manage. She organized everything. She coordinated with the rehabilitation center. She fought with my insurance company with a ferocity that would have made generals weep. She was, in the chaos of those first weeks, the most solid thing in my world. The Ashford brothers came less frequently as the weeks passed. I noticed, but I told myself reasonable things. They had their own lives, their own coursework, their own obligations. I was not their responsibility. It was enough that they came when they could. I told myself that right up until the evening my mother stepped out to get us both food from the place down the street, and I heard voices in the hallway, and recognized Rowan's voice among them, and then heard him say low but not low enough, "I don't know how to do this, River. This isn't what I signed up for." And River's reply, careful and quiet, "None of us did. But we can't just disappear." And Reed, whose silence had always felt like love, "Can't we? He's not going to be the same. Things are different now." I lay very still in my hospital bed. The darkness around me felt different suddenly, heavier, textured with something new and awful. I counted my own heartbeats because it gave me something to do while the floor fell out from under everything. They came in after another moment. They were kind. They were careful. They talked about small things. Campus news, a film that had come out, something River had cooked the night before. And I listened to every word with new ears. Ears that were no longer willing to be deceived. And I understood that I had been loving a dream that 3 real people had never actually offered me. They were gone within a month. Not all at once, that might have been cleaner, more honest. Instead, the visits simply spaced out. The messages came less frequently and then stopped entirely. Rowan sent a text one evening that was full of words like space and complexity and where we are right now, and I read it with my text-to-speech application and didn't reply. Because I didn't know what reply existed for something like that. River called once, but I let it go to voicemail. Reed said nothing at all, which was, I supposed, his version of consistency. I was in the rehabilitation center by then, learning the language of a sightless world. I was learning to move through a room by sound and memory, and the thin white cane that clicked against the floor and told me, in its quiet way, what lay ahead. I was learning to read Braille, my fingertips finding patterns in the raised dots with a slowness that frustrated me every single day. I was learning that the world was full of sound I had never properly heard before. The specific way footsteps change when someone is approaching versus retreating, the way a room sounds differently when it's crowded versus empty. The hum that different appliances make the texture of wind. I was also learning, much more painfully, what it meant to grieve a relationship that had never been as real as I'd believed. My rehabilitation counselor was a woman named Denise, and she had an extraordinary gift for asking questions that cracked things open in exactly the way they needed to be cracked. In one of her sessions, maybe 6 weeks into my stay, she asked me what I was most afraid of. I thought about it for a long time. Then I said that I'm unlovable like this, that whoever I was before was enough for someone to want, and whoever I am now isn't. Denise was quiet for a moment. Then she said very gently, "What if the someone who wanted you before didn't actually want you at all? And what if who you are now is exactly who was always worth loving?" I didn't have an answer for that. But I kept the question, turned it over in my hands in the dark, and waited to see what it might grow into. His name was Jody Miller, and I heard him before I ever formed any impression of him at all. It was a Thursday afternoon, 7 weeks after I'd arrived at the rehabilitation center. The center had a common room where residents gathered during the designated social hours, a requirement I mostly tolerated by sitting in the corner with my headphones around my neck, present in body if not particularly in spirit. I had made a few acquaintances. I had not made any friends. I was not at that point particularly interested in friends. I was interested in surviving the days and learning enough skills to eventually go home and figure out who I was going to be next. The common room that afternoon was its usual hum of conversation and the television that someone always had on too loud. I was turning a paper cup in my hands, tracing the rim of it with my index finger when someone sat down across from me, not a resident I could tell from the energy of it. The way their movement had a certainty and ease that most of us in recovery were still working to rebuild, and said, "You look like someone who is very successfully pretending to be fine." The voice was medium deep, unhurried, with a quality of calm that didn't feel practiced. It was just how he sounded. like he had come to terms with something fundamental about existence and wasn't in a particular rush about anything on the other side of it. I am extremely successfully pretending to be fine, I said, because I didn't have the energy for anything less than honesty that afternoon. A sound that was somewhere between a breath and a laugh. Fair enough. I'm Jody. I'm here to visit my uncle, but he's in a session until 4, so I'm using the time constructively by sitting in the corner of the common room. Stan, I said. I'm using the time constructively by holding a paper cup. Important work, Jody said. Cups don't hold themselves. I turned toward him, which was an automatic gesture that didn't accomplish much functionally but still felt necessary, the way you orient your body toward whoever is speaking to you even when sight isn't part of the conversation. Are you going to ask me what happened? No, he said simply. Something in me relaxed by about 1.5 degrees. Most people do. Most people are dealing with their own discomfort when they do that, Jody said. The question is usually more about them than about you. I considered that. That's a fairly perceptive thing to say to a stranger. I'm a fairly perceptive person, he said, without any particular arrogance in it, just a statement of fact, delivered with the same unhurried certainty as everything else. Also, my uncle has been here for 2 months. I come every Thursday. I've had a lot of time to think about how people navigate difficult situations, and how other people respond to watching someone navigate a difficult situation. And how do other people respond? Mostly with their own fear, he said. Fear of what it would mean for them if it happened to them. It gets dressed up as concern, but the core of it is usually just someone confronting their own mortality or fragility through yours. I set the paper cup down on the table between us. Your uncle is lucky to have you visiting every Thursday. He'd say I just come for the terrible vending machine coffee, Jody said. Is that true? A pause. Partially. We talked for another 40 minutes until a staff member came to let him know his uncle was available. He left without asking for my number, without making any pointed remarks about seeing me again, without any of the social choreography I'd come to expect from people who wanted something from me. He just said it was good to meet me and left. I sat for a while after, still and quiet, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not happiness exactly. More like an awareness that the world contained, somewhere within it, a person who had made me feel like myself for 40 minutes without requiring anything in exchange. He was there the following Thursday. And the one after that. Our conversations ranged widely and without agenda. He told me about his work. He designed audio landscapes for immersive experiences, which meant he spent his days thinking about how sound moved through space and the way the brain constructed reality from acoustic information. It was, he said, the kind of work that had taken him a long time to find because he'd spent years trying to do work that made more conventional sense before he accepted that what actually absorbed him was something most people didn't even have a word for. I told him about my work before the accident. I'd been studying structural engineering, which I had loved for its logic and its precision and the way it was ultimately about making things that held together under pressure. He found the parallels between our work genuinely interesting, the way both of us were engaged with questions of how forces moved through systems and what gave things strength. Somewhere around the 4th or 5th Thursday, I realized that I was looking forward to those visits in a way that had started to feel structural itself, load-bearing, essential, something I'd built my week around without entirely meaning to. I did not let myself think too much about what that meant. The Ashford debacle had left me with a profound distrust of my own interpretations of things. I had been wrong before in the most complete and embarrassing way possible, and the wreckage of that wrongness was still something I was picking through. So I filed Jody Miller under person I look forward to talking to, and left the folder unlabeled and tried not to examine it too closely. What I was not expecting was for Jody's uncle to mention to his nephew in passing that the young man he'd been hearing about, Stan, the structural engineering student, the one with the good laugh, had mentioned to his counselor that he didn't have many people visiting him at the center. What I was not expecting was for Jody to appear on a Wednesday. "You're a day early," I said, when the staff member at the door of my room told me I had a visitor. I knew before she finished his name. "My uncle's appointment got moved," Jody said from the doorway. His voice moved into the room like he was giving it space, not crowding it. "I figured if I was coming anyway, I could see if you wanted company for a walk. There's a path behind the building. Your counselor says it's a good one." I sat up straighter. "You talked to my counselor?" "She talked to me," he said. "She's terrifying, by the way, in an admirable way." Denise was, in fact, terrifying in an admirable way. I said so. She mentioned the path and said the fresh air might do you good. I mentioned I'd be happy to walk it with you if you were interested. She said to ask you. There was no pressure in it, no performance of concern, just an offer, clean and direct, with the exit clearly visible from all angles. All right, I said, give me a minute. The path was about a quarter-mile looping behind the center through what I gathered was a small garden area. I could smell things blooming, something sweet and sharp at the same time, and the ground beneath my cane was soft in places where the path was lined with grass. Jody walked on my right, not so close that it felt like surveillance, not so far that the distance felt pointed. He didn't try to steer me or hover. When I paused to recalibrate with the cane, he paused too, unhurried, and said something light and unremarkable about whatever we'd been talking about, giving me the dignity of a moment that wasn't being observed and analyzed. Halfway around the loop, I said, without quite planning to, why do you keep coming? He was quiet for a moment, and it was the kind of quiet that was thinking, not deflecting. Because I like talking to you, he said finally, and because you seem like someone who doesn't have enough people in their corner right now, and because I think you're worth showing up for. The words landed somewhere in the center of my chest and just stayed there. I'm not the same person I was before, I said. It came out before I could dress it up or put it at a safer distance. It was just the rawest version of the fear, offered out loud to the autumn air and whoever was walking beside me in it. I imagine not, Jody said. Nobody's the same person they were 6 months ago. The shape of the change is just more visible in your case. That's either very wise or very insufficient, I said. Possibly both, he acknowledged. What I mean is, you're still the person who talks about load-bearing structures like they're poetry. You're still the person who knows an embarrassing amount about the history of bridges. You're still the person who makes the worst puns I've encountered in a professional context. We were sitting in a common room, I said. That's not a professional context. You are professionally bad at puns, he said. It's a calling. I laughed, actually laughed from somewhere real, not the social laugh I'd been producing on demand for weeks. It surprised me, the realness of it. We finished the loop in comfortable quiet. When we got back to the building's rear entrance, he asked if the same time tomorrow would work. You have your uncle's appointment tomorrow, I said. I'll come twice, he said, as if this were obvious. I stood for a moment, my hand on the door handle, the warmth of the building coming through the metal of it. Jody, I said. Yeah, thank you. I said it simply, the way it deserved to be said. Stan, he replied with the same unhurried warmth he brought to everything. Thank you for walking with me. The months passed in the specific way that rehabilitation time passes, both excruciatingly slow in the daily grind of it and somehow accelerated in retrospect, so that when I look back it has the quality of a film that was edited thoughtfully, each scene weighted, nothing wasted. I made progress, some days slowly, some days in leaps that surprised even the doctors. The swelling was reducing, the optic nerve was showing signs of response. There were moments, not vision, not exactly, but precursors to it. The edges of light and shadow returning in fragments, like a photograph developing slowly in a dark room. My medical team was cautious about timelines and careful about hope in the measured way that good doctors are, giving you enough hope to sustain the work without building structures that might not hold. I learned the center like I had once learned city blocks, by rhythm and reference, by the count of steps between my room and the common room, between the common room and the therapy wing, between the therapy wing and the garden path that had become, in a matter of weeks, one of my most important places. Jody came twice a week now. His uncle had finished his stay at the center and transitioned to outpatient care, but Jody still came. This was not a small thing, and I was aware of it with a clarity that the blindness had, paradoxically, made sharper. When you can't see someone's expression, you learn to read everything else, the weight of their presence, the rhythm of their breath, the small adjustments in their voice when something is affecting them. I had become a careful listener in ways I hadn't been before. And what I heard when I listened to Jody was someone who came because he wanted to be there, without agenda, without the performance of sacrifice. We talked about his work. He had started bringing small recordings sometimes, sound files on his phone that he developed for whatever project he was currently building, and we'd sit in the garden when the weather allowed and he'd describe them to me as he played them, asking what I heard, what the sound made me feel. There was something about water moving through stone that we spent a whole afternoon on. There was an hour-long conversation about silence, about the way the absence of sound isn't actually absence but a different kind of presence. It was during one of these afternoons in the garden, in the specific quality of autumn light that I was beginning to perceive again as warmth on my face even before my eyes could process it, that Jody said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You ask me personal things every time we talk," I said. "I'm not sure you need permission. This one is different." I waited. "Were you in love with those three guys?" he asked. No preamble, no softening. Just the question, delivered with the same directness that was one of the things I had come to understand as fundamentally Jody. The belief that an honest question asked plainly was kinder than a dishonest question asked gently. I had not told him the story directly, but we had talked around it enough that he'd assembled something of the shape of it, the way you can understand a building from its shadow, even when you can't see the structure itself. "I thought I was," I said. "I think I was in love with the idea of being chosen, and there were three of them, and they all seemed to want me. And after a long time of not feeling particularly wanted by anyone, that was docked." I stopped. Intoxicating isn't a flattering word for it, but it's the honest one. "And when things got hard," Jody said carefully, "they left." "They left," I confirmed. "In the way that people who were never really committed to anything leave, gracefully, apologetically, with words that sound like reasons but are actually just exits dressed up in good grammar." A silence. The sound of leaves somewhere above us, September doing its slow work of transformation. "Were you heartbroken?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. "Yes," I said, "but I think most of the heartbreak was about losing who I thought I was when they were paying attention to me, which probably tells you everything about how real any of it was." Another silence. Then, "For what it's worth," Jody said, "who you are when nobody is performing interest at you is significantly more interesting than whoever you were being for them." I turned toward his voice. "How do you know who I was being for them?" "I don't," he said, "but I know who you are right now. And whoever this is, the person who talks about suspension bridges with genuine passion and makes catastrophic puns and cried at the audio I played you last week. The one about the rain on the old roof tiles? This person is someone worth knowing." My chest did something complicated. That recording made everyone cry. It was objectively devastating. "It made me cry," he agreed, "but we're talking about you." I let the deflection go because he had let me use it. "Jody," I said, "Stan, are you?" I said, "Stan, are you?" I stopped, started again. "I'm not good at this." I was apparently not good at it even before I had additional reasons to be cautious about it. "But are you here because you feel sorry for me?" The pause that followed was long enough that I could hear the garden breathing around us. The specific autumn sound of things preparing to let go, comfortable in the knowledge that they would return. "No," he said. "I'm here because I drove past a Thai restaurant on my way over and thought Stan would find something withering to say about the name of that restaurant, and I wanted to be the person who heard it." I laughed, the real kind again. "What was the name?" "Dye-rific." "That's not withering material, that's just tragic," I said. "There's nothing to do with that except mourn." "That's exactly what I thought," Jody said. "See? Worth making the drive." The day the bandages came off, metaphorically speaking, since my condition hadn't required bandages, only time and rest and the stubborn biological process of healing, was also in autumn, but a year later, when the trees were doing the same theatrical descent into gold and amber that they'd been doing the previous year, when I'd been lying in a hospital bed for the first time. The vision returned gradually, which the doctors had warned me about. It wasn't like turning on a light. It was more like a dial being turned, almost imperceptibly slowly, so that each day brought fractionally more clarity than the one before, and the aggregate of many such days was a world that slowly reassembled itself around me. Colors came back before details, light and shadow before contour, the ability to perceive movement before the ability to identify what was moving. My mother cried when I called to tell her. She made me describe everything I could see 3 times, and each time I described it she cried again, and I didn't mind at all. I told Jody on a Wednesday, because Wednesdays and Thursdays were his days, and Wednesday was the first one available. He said, "How does it feel?" Not "that's amazing," or "congratulations," or any of the things people say when they are performing the correct response to good news. Just, "How does it feel?" "Strange," I said. "Like relearning a language I thought I knew? Like, I've been reading text with my hands for a year and now the letters are appearing on a page and it's somehow more information than I know how to process." "That makes sense," he said. "You've been using different systems. They'll integrate. That's very structural engineering of you." "I've been listening to you for a long time," he said. "Some of it stuck. The integration took months more. The rehabilitation center transitioned my care to outpatient. I started going back to the university, slowly, to see about my degree, about the path forward, about the question of what a structural engineering career looked like from the other side of an experience like mine." My advisor was kind. The university had accommodations it had not previously needed to offer me. The other students, my year mates who were now a year ahead of me, were awkward in the particular way of young people confronted with reminders of mortality, but they meant well and I was patient with them in the way that I had become patient with most things. I saw the Ashford brothers exactly once during this time. Rowan and River together, coming out of a coffee shop near the engineering building on a Friday afternoon. River saw me first and said something to Rowan, and Rowan turned, and for a moment all three of us stood in the autumn air in the middle of the sidewalk and looked at each other. Rowan said, "Stan, you look, I can see again," I said. Not warmly, not coldly, just a statement of fact, delivered to the air between us. River had the grace to look pained. "We heard, we're really glad." I looked at them both, really looked, with my slowly reassembling visual system, and I saw two young men who were not particularly complicated villains. They were just people who had been unkind in the particular unremarkable way of people who didn't know what they wanted and took from others while they figured it out. They were not worth hatred. They were barely worth the footnote they occupied in the ongoing narrative of my life. "Thank you," I said. "Take care." I walked past them and into the coffee shop and ordered something warm and stood at the counter and watched the street through the window, watched them walk in the opposite direction, watched the distance open between us, and felt nothing particular at all, or not nothing. Something specific and quiet, like closing a book and setting it aside, not because you hated it, but because you'd read it thoroughly enough to know you didn't need to return to it. The absence of bitterness surprised me. I'd expected more of it, but somewhere in the past year, in the hours on the garden path and the conversations about sound and space and the specific way a load-bearing structure distributes weight, I had set down the heaviest things I'd been carrying about the Ashford brothers and found that the ground was more solid without them. I texted Jody from the coffee shop. Just saw them. Rowan and River. Felt almost nothing. Is that growth, or am I finally just broken in all the right places? His reply came 3 minutes later, probably both. Also, coffee shop, or are you at the engineering building? I typed, coffee shop. Near engineering. Why? I'm parked outside, he said. Was going to surprise you, but you texted first. I looked up from my phone and through the window at the parking area across the street, and I saw a car I recognized because he described it to me in enough detail that I'd built a mental image of it long before I could see it. Dark green, old, with a very minor dent in the rear left panel that he hadn't gotten around to fixing because he claimed it gave the car character. I walked outside. He was leaning against the passenger side, hands in his jacket pockets, and this was the first time I was truly seeing him, not perceiving him, not imagining him from his voice and presence, but seeing him with eyes that were functional and increasingly reliable. He was medium height, lean in the way of people who forget to stop moving, with brown hair that was doing something complicated in the wind, and a face that was not conventionally striking in the way the Ashford brothers' faces had been striking. His face was something better than striking. It was honest. It was open in a way that matched the voice I had memorized over many months, a face that didn't have anything to hide and had therefore never bothered developing the architecture of concealment. He looked at me looking at him and he said, "How's the visual system today?" "Better," I said. "I can see a very minor dent in the rear left panel." "That dent has character," he said. "I know," I said. "You've mentioned." We looked at each other for another moment. The autumn wind was doing things to the leaves above us. The coffee shop window glowed warm and gold behind me. Jody, I said. Still here, he said. You've been showing up for a year, I said. Twice a week, mostly. You drove a 40-minute round trip to sit in a rehabilitation center common room and talk to someone who couldn't see you. The common room has very good vending machine coffee, he said. And when I didn't laugh, he dropped the deflection and said simply, yes, I have been. Why? Not the same why I'd asked before. In the garden? Cautious and guarded and half expecting the answer to be something manageable and safe? This was a different why, asked with eyes that were working, asked with a year's worth of accumulated evidence, asked with the full knowledge that I was asking something real and large. Jody was quiet for a moment, the same thinking quiet I knew from hundreds of hours of conversation. Because the first day I talked to you, he said you made a pun so bad that I spent the whole drive home trying to figure out if it had been intentional. And when I concluded that it had been intentional, I thought, I want to know this person better. And every week I came and I knew you better, and the answer to that question just kept being yes. I crossed the sidewalk. I stopped when I was close enough to see the specific gray of his eyes, which was nothing like the storm cloud gray of the Ashford brothers' eyes. It was warmer threaded with brown, the gray of morning sky before the light fully arrives. I'm going to need you to be very clear with me, I said, because my track record for reading situations is not good, and I would rather ask and be wrong than not ask and Stan, he said. Yes, I am in love with you, he said. I have been for a while. I wasn't going to say anything until you were ready because the point was never to replace something or to take advantage of a difficult time. The point was just to be there, and to let whatever needed to develop in its own way. But since you're asking, the words sat in the autumn air between us, solid and unhurried. Exactly like him. Okay, I said. He waited. I think I've been in love with you, I said, since the second Thursday, possibly the first. I've been very carefully not examining it for self-protective reasons. The corner of his mouth moved. Self-protective reasons. My previous record as established. Your previous record involved people who were performing interest, he said. That's not the same category. I know, I said. I know that. I just needed to be sure you knew what you were getting. Someone who can't always trust his own judgment. Someone who spent the last year rebuilding himself from some fairly significant damage. Someone whose navigation of his own emotions is, historically, unreliable. Jody looked at me steadily the way he always did, unhurried, without performance. I know exactly what I'm getting, he said. I've been paying attention for a year. I stepped forward and closed the remaining distance between us, and he met me in it. And the first time Jody Miller put his arms around me, I felt it the way I had learned to feel everything in the dark, with my whole self, my whole body, my whole awareness, nothing filtered out, nothing taken for granted. We stood on the sidewalk in the autumn wind while the leaves came down around us and the coffee shop glowed behind me, and I thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like, not the vertigo of being dazzled, not the hunger of being chosen by people who would unchoose you when things became inconvenient. This solid, unhurried, fully present thing, this was what I had been trying to find when I had mistaken performance for love. I want to say something about the moment before we went to dinner, because it matters, and because it is the kind of thing that gets lost in the telling, if you're not careful. We stood on that sidewalk for longer than was probably reasonable, just existing in the autumn air with the knowledge of what we had just said to each other. Not kissing, not rushing anywhere. Just the two of us and the space between us, and the understanding that the space had permanently changed. I kept looking at him. I know I was doing it in a way that was probably obvious, because I had spent so long knowing him by voice and by presence and by the particular quality of warmth that radiated off another person when they are genuinely glad to be in the same place as you. And now I could look at him. Now his face was available to me in the way that I had once taken for granted and would never take for granted again. The way morning light catches on a person's features. The way expression moves through a face not in its dramatic forms but in the small continuous adjustments, the slight shift at the corner of a mouth, the micro-change of focus in the eyes when a thought arrives. All of it visible, all of it real. He caught me looking and didn't say anything, which was exactly right, because saying anything would have acknowledged the looking in a way that would have made it self-conscious. And instead he just met my eyes for a moment with that unhurried attention, and then looked away at the street. Comfortable, undemanding, giving me the moment without making it into a performance. That, I thought, was love. Not the declaration we had just made, though the declaration mattered, but this, being seen in the act of looking and being given the space to keep looking without having to explain it or manage it or perform gratitude for being permitted it. Just the simple, enormous gift of being in the presence of someone who is comfortable with your attention. We went to dinner that evening. The first dinner where the knowledge of what we were to each other was present at the table alongside the menus and the candle and the bread basket. It was a small Italian place that he had been to before and described to me once during one of our garden conversations in enough detail that when I walked in, I recognized it, or felt that I did, which amounted to the same thing. We talked about everything and nothing, the way you do when you've spent a year building towards something and now you're finally inside it, and the relief of it makes every ordinary thing feel luminous. The bread, the way the candle threw shadows. A story about something that had happened to his colleague that week. Something I'd read about bridge construction in the 17th century, which he listened to with genuine attention, because he always listened with genuine attention, not waiting for his turn to speak but actually receiving what I was saying. Partway through the main course, he reached across the table and put his hand over mine. I looked down at his hand. I could see it now, see it properly, see the details of it, the specific quality of it, and I thought about all the months when I had known this hand only by touch and sound and presence, and how none of that had made it less real. "Are you still afraid?" he asked. "That you're unlovable like this?" He'd remembered the thing I'd said to Denise, the thing that had become part of the fabric of everything I was working through. He'd remembered because he always listened. I thought about the question honestly, the way he would have wanted me to. "Less," I said. "I think I understand now that the question was wrong. I wasn't unlovable before and I'm not now. The issue was that I was around people who were never actually engaged in loving me. That's different." "It is different," he said. "You helped me understand that," I said. "Not by telling me, just by showing up and being consistent and treating me like someone worth being consistent about." His hand was warm over mine. "You are worth being consistent about." "I know," I said. And I was surprised to find that I did know it and that the knowing was settled in me somewhere deep. Not something I was saying to perform confidence, but something that had become structural load-bearing, part of the architecture of who I was now. We left the restaurant when it was late and the street was quiet and walked to his car in the cold air. And he drove me back to the apartment I had returned to several weeks earlier, when my mobility was reliable enough and my visual system stable enough to navigate independently. The apartment that my mother had reorganized in my absence and then reorganized again differently once I could see it and expressed opinions about what she'd done with my books. He walked me to the door, which was not required and which I had not asked for and which I appreciated enormously. At the door I said, "I'm going to be slow at this." "I'm not in a hurry," he said. "I mean it. I need." I searched for the word. I need things to develop at a pace I can track. I don't do well with velocity right now. My calibration is still. It's still calibrating. "Stan," he said. "I sat in a rehabilitation center common room every week for a year. Do I seem like someone who does things fast?" I thought about it. "No," I admitted. "We'll go at whatever pace works," he said. "And if the pace changes, you tell me. And if I'm not reading something right, you tell me that too. I'm perceptive, but I'm not psychic." "You are sometimes unnervingly perceptive," I said. "Professionally trained attention," he said, "comes with the territory when your job is listening." I unlocked the door. I stood in the doorway with the light of the apartment coming through behind me. I looked at him, still learning the visual reality of him, still mapping the correspondence between what I'd imagined and what I could now see, and I felt the specific quality of a thing in its right place. "Good night, Jody," I said. "Good night, Stan," he said. He waited until I was inside. I heard his footsteps moving away, unhurried, the same rhythm I had learned by sound before I could track it by sight. I stood in my apartment and listened until the sound of his car starting up reached me through the window and then the quiet of his absence, which was not an empty quiet, but the specific, rich silence of someone who has been there and will be there again. The following months were the first ones in a long time that felt like building rather than surviving. My coursework resumed in earnest. My degree was delayed but not derailed, and my advisor had worked carefully to construct a path that accounted for my time away without making the path significantly longer or more complicated than it needed to be. There was a paper I was working on, a theoretical framework for stress distribution in asymmetric load-bearing structures, which had been my area of interest before the accident and had only deepened during my time without sight. When I had thought about load-bearing in different ways, in the ways that weren't about steel and concrete, and I returned to it with a clarity I hadn't had before. Denise, my counselor, transitioned me to monthly check-ins and then to as needed. On our last regular session, she asked me what had changed most. I sat with the question the way she'd trained me to sit with questions, not reaching for the first available answer, but letting the real one surface at its own pace. I think I used to believe, I said finally, that love was something that happened to you, like weather, like light, something external that illuminated you and made you real. I was waiting to be loved so that I could feel like I existed. Denise nodded in the way I could now see and had once only inferred from the quality of her silence. And now I think love is something you participate in, I said. It's not weather, it's more like structural engineering. You build it deliberately, with the right materials, with attention to how forces work. And the strength of it depends on the quality of the construction, not on how impressive it looks from the outside. She smiled, which I could see. That's the most structural engineering metaphor for love I've ever heard. I've had a lot of time to work on it, I said. Jody and I navigated the early months of what we were to each other with the care that both of us had developed, in different ways, through different means, for handling things that mattered. We did not rush. We found our rhythm the way good structures find their equilibrium, not through force but through the patient application of correct principles. He brought me to his studio one afternoon a month or two in and showed me the work in progress he'd been building since before we met, an immersive sound installation about the experience of sensory transition, about the way the brain rewires itself when one input channel is altered. He'd been researching it, he said, because he'd become interested in what my experience had taught him about acoustic architecture. I stood in the middle of the room with the headphones on and listened to what he'd made, and it was, I don't have the right word for what it was. It was the experience of losing something and learning to navigate the loss and finding that the navigation itself had changed you into something that could receive forms of information you hadn't been capable of before. It was dark at first, the sound of darkness, not absence but density. And then slowly, layer by layer, the world reconstructing itself in sound, and then, at the end, silence again, but a different silence. An arrived silence. A silence that contained everything that had come before it rather than simply being the absence of everything. I stood in the middle of the room and I cried, which I was not embarrassed about, and when I took the headphones off he was watching me with that particular quality of attention that was his most characteristic feature. The attention that was interested and careful and fully present. That's us, I said. Partially, he said. It's also everyone who's ever had to relearn something they thought they knew. But partially us. Partially us, he agreed. I handed him back the headphones and crossed the studio to where he was standing and put my hands on either side of his face because I could. Because my hands worked and my eyes worked and he was real and present and had made something beautiful partly about the experience of knowing me. I love you, I said. First time those specific words in that specific order, and unlike every other time I'd approached those words, the times with the Ashford brothers that I had mistaken for love without ever actually saying it, this time the words felt accurate, not performed, not aspirational, just true the way a correctly engineered thing is true, measured and verified and reliable under load. Jody's hands came up and covered mine, and his expression did something complicated and honest that I was grateful to be able to see. I love you, he said. Simple, unhurried, in the same tone as everything else he'd ever told me, because he had been consistent from the beginning, which was the most important thing. A year and a half after the accident, I gave a talk at the university's Rehabilitation Medicine Symposium. Not a big speech, not a keynote. A small panel discussion about the experience of navigating sensory rehabilitation while maintaining academic and personal identity. There were 3 of us on the panel, and we each had a different story, and the room was full of medical professionals and researchers and a few students who were doing projects in related areas. At some point, one of the researchers asked me what had been most important to my recovery. She meant clinically. She was looking for the answer about occupational therapy, or the specific protocol, or the role of medication. I answered those things first because they were real and important, but then I said there was also a person, someone who showed up and kept showing up without any agenda other than being present. And I think the clinical and the personal aren't separable in the way we sometimes treat them as if they are. The structural repairs were happening at a cellular level, in the optic nerve and the brain tissue and the neural pathways. But the meaning-making, the part that made it possible to believe the repairs were worth making, that happened in conversations, in the garden path behind the center, in a common room with terrible vending machine coffee. There was a small laugh from the room. I smiled at it. I spent some of the early months of my blindness grieving a relationship that turned out to have been a performance, I said, and some of the later months understanding that what I had been grieving wasn't the relationship, but the version of myself I believed existed inside it. The recovery gave me the version of myself that doesn't need that, the version that can give love and receive it without requiring performance in either direction. Afterward, in the corridor outside the lecture hall, I found Jody waiting because he had known the time and had come. He was looking at his phone when I came out, and when he looked up and saw me, he put the phone away with the particular absence of ceremony that meant he was glad to see me but not performing gladness. "How was it?" he said. "Good," I said. "I talked about you. I heard the terrible vending machine coffee line," he said. "The door was open. The coffee was genuinely terrible," I said. "It really was," he agreed. We walked out of the building into the afternoon, which was the particular quality of afternoon that this time of year always is, now and always will be, full of the specific light of things changing, everything preparing to let go and return and be different next time, which is not a loss but a design, the most elegant design, the one that holds because it knows how to yield. Jody's hand found mine on the way to the car. I had not asked for it. He had not announced it. It was simply there. The way things are there when they are right and real and built correctly, when every element is in its proper place and the whole structure is doing what it was designed to do, bearing what it was made to bear. Holding. I think about the accident sometimes in the quiet way you think about things that have become part of the architecture of your history rather than active emergencies. Not with horror, not with residual panic, but with the particular quality of attention you give to something that changed the floor plan of your life so fundamentally that the original layout is now almost unimaginable. I was 23 and crossing a street and the world went dark. And in the darkness, I discovered that the person I had been before the darkness was not someone I needed to return to. That person had been gathering at the wrong tables, had been confusing the warmth of being noticed for the warmth of being known, had been so grateful for the attention of beautiful, powerful, unavailable people that he had called that gratitude love and believed the label. The darkness did not make me better. I want to say that clearly, because there is a kind of story that treats suffering as the necessary price of growth, as if the universe runs on a moral economy where pain is always redeemed by wisdom. I don't believe that. The accident was not a gift. The blindness was not a teacher. They were simply things that happened. Difficult things, and I navigated them as well as I could with the help of good medicine and a terrifying counselor and my mother's ferocious love. And, eventually, Jody. Jody is what made the difference. Not the darkness, not the loss, not the slow process of rebuilding my visual system or the discipline of learning Braille or the humbling work of relearning how to move through a world that had suddenly become opaque. All of those things I did, and they mattered. But the thing that actually healed the deepest damage, the damage to my understanding of what I was worth and what love was supposed to feel like, was being in the presence week after week of someone who showed up not because I was useful or interesting or beautiful or a pleasant diversion, but simply because I was me, and to him that was sufficient. He is the rival of the story's title, which always makes me smile a little, because the word rival implies a competition, and the Ashford brothers were never competing for anything real. They were playing a game with each other that I happened to be the token in. Jody never competed. Jody simply arrived, consistent and unhurried, and waited for me to understand that what was on offer was real. Understanding it took time. Understanding it required me to become someone who could receive it without immediately distrusting it, and that process was the actual work of the past year and a half. Not the physical rehabilitation, though, that was hard enough, but the interior work of dismantling the architecture of unworthiness that I had apparently been building for years and replacing it with something that would hold under actual load. The something that would hold is still under construction. I suspect it always will be. The engineers I admire most are the ones who understand that structures require ongoing attention, regular inspection, necessary repair, intelligent response to the stresses that accumulate over time. A bridge doesn't stop needing to be a bridge because it was built correctly. It maintains itself through continued engagement with its own design principles. I am trying to be a bridge rather than a monument, to stay responsive, engaged, load-bearing in the ongoing sense rather than frozen in whatever shape I managed at my best moment and left to withstand everything that follows without maintenance. Jody helps. He is the most honest person I know, which means he tells me the truth about what he sees, including the things I'd rather not examine. And he does it with the same unhurried kindness that he brings to everything. He is not without flaw. He forgets to eat when he's deep in a project. He has a truly catastrophic sense of direction that I, with my now functional visual system and engineered understanding of spatial relationships, have become the designated navigator of. He has opinions about certain kinds of film music that he will advance at some length, and which I disagree with completely, and which have produced some of the most entertaining arguments of my life. He's also the person who noticed 3 weeks into my return to full coursework that I was getting the particular kind of tired that wasn't about sleep, but about carrying too much, and said so directly, and helped me figure out what I was carrying and whether I was doing it because I had to or because I hadn't yet given myself permission to put any of it down. He is also the person who drove 40 minutes round trip twice a week for months to sit with someone he had met in a rehabilitation center and found worth the drive. That person, that specific, unhurried, perceptive, frequently infuriating about film music person, is the person I go home to now. The person whose car I can identify in a parking lot by the dent in the rear left panel that absolutely does give the car character. The person whose voice, after all these months, I still find myself listening to with the particular acute attention I developed when listening was the primary way I understood the world. Not because I need to anymore, but because it turns out that hearing someone fully with your whole attention is one of the better things you can do. I cross streets differently now. I don't think about it constantly. That kind of hypervigilance would be its own kind of damage. But there is a quality of presence I bring to the physical world that I didn't bring before. A reminder embedded in my body that the ordinary moments are not a rehearsal for the important ones. The ordinary moments are the important ones. The coffee and the autumn light and the leaves coming down and the hand in yours on the way to the car. All of it is what it is, and it will not last forever, and it is, right now, exactly enough. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.